answers, and more especially at a time when the world needs direction from Africa's young people and African young people in the diaspora. So we really appreciate that. The second thing is, let's also congratulate the summit for being able to continue under the conditions, but more especially to be able to understand and appreciate that the innovation that we require of ideas right now is very important for us to structure the future of the continent and the future of the world. The role that we have to play as an African continent is very critical. I want to also thank the CEO of the Dare to Dream Foundation, being that of Mr. Paul Majaji, an excellent personality, and we just really appreciate the work that has been done, and we will continue to appreciate every effort that this opportunity presents for us to then be able to create responsiveness to the kinds of issues that we face. So I am Magdalene Matsami, I'm South African, and I do a few things. But the panel that I have that's joining me today, and our discussion, let me first start with giving you a sense of what we will be discussing. So we are really, in principle, discussing the issue of human rights. And we will be looking, and this is what I want our panelists to also take cognizance of, is we'll be focusing on issues around addressing the stigma and discrimination, the issues of prevention of violence against women, support for vulnerable and key populations, quarantine and restrictive measures, shortages of supplies, and then also the oversight of accountability mechanisms in respective African countries that would allow individuals who are impacted to challenge the appropriateness of those restrictions. Those are quite critical issues. We don't have much time. We want to give the audience a chance to participate, but I'm going to start by introducing the panel and then giving you the way forward in terms of how we will proceed. So on our panel, we have Alexandra Fitzgerald. Alexandra is an admitted attorney at the High Court and a senior legal officer at the South African Human Rights Commission. Welcome, Alex, if it's comfortable for us to call you Alex. And prior to joining the commission, Alex practiced law as in terms of corporate mergers and acquisitions as an associate at Norton Rose Fulbright, and served also as a law research clerk to the Chief Justice Judge Mogoeng. So that's quite a task, and we are confident that there are some questions that we'll be able to, and answers and direction we will definitely get from Alex. And of course, Alex is a former Mail and Guardian Top 200 Young South African and a fellow of the Center for African Studies for Harvard. We also have from Kenya, MK Gamaliel. And MK is an attorney and activist from Kenya, a former communications director at Hope in Action Sweden, East Africa, and the DRC office, founder of Dialogue Villages DRC, an initiative that is developing mobile smart libraries for the rural Congo communities, and interactive SGBV app that has provided a timely response for sexual and gender-based violence in the region. That's amazing, and we welcome Mr. Gamaliel. We also have with us Cynthia Chigwenya. Sorry, can you just wave and greet us so that we don't have to feel so cold wherever we're coming from? MK.
Yeah.
We don't see. Yeah. I don't see MK. Why do I?
Can you see me?
No, I do not see MK. Maybe you must check that you must share your video, or we also have with us, I'm sure that Sibu will attend to that, Cynthia Chigwenya. And Cynthia is a 2020 Konrad Adenauer Foundation Scholar in Economic Diplomacy Program at the South African Institute of International Affairs. Cynthia has contributed to the London School of Economics paper on macroeconomics impacts of COVID-19 on the African continent. And prior to joining the SAIIA, Cynthia worked for the National Commission for the fight against genocide in Kigali, Rwanda, and for the Open Society Initiative for South Africa. So we also welcome another esteemed panelist, Cynthia. Then we have Lebohang Matsoso. Advocate Lebohang Matsoso is a duly admitted and enrolled advocate from the Kingdom of Lesotho. So we have someone from the Kingdom of Lesotho. I'm not sure if Advocate Matsoso is also part of the royal family. Currently, Lebohang is...
No, I'm not from the royal family.
Okay.
I'm just an ordinary citizen from the Mountain Kingdom of Lesotho.
Welcome.
Thank you so much.
He is also an assistant coordinator at the Turkish Cooperation and Coordination Agency, otherwise known as TICA, which is based in South Africa. So we always believe that Lesotho is a province of South Africa here, Mr. Matsoso. So I'm sure you agree now that you are in South Africa. And Lebohang's duties include coordinating developmental projects which seek to promote socioeconomic rights in South Africa, Lesotho and Eswatini. Now, I want us to bear cognizance of time. So what I'm going to do is just allow ourselves first to just have a basic snapshot of what is expected from the panelists. We are going to allow panelists to make their presentations between 5 and 6 minutes at maximum. Try and reduce it as possible so that we can have more time for interaction. On the issue of social stigma, I think we will all discuss around the negative associations between people that have been created as a result of the COVID, the fear aspect, the confusion around the pandemic and the virus, the social cohesion aspects and how it has affected race relations, police brutality. I think that would also be one aspect that falls within the vulnerability issues of fake news and how fake news affects social stigma. More importantly, how do we create that social cohesion and solidarity in our societies? But what then becomes the future? And one of the things that we must be cognizant of, in as much as we are in our own fields respected and understand the world of technology, there are so many of our people in the continent, in the diaspora, who may not have the benefit of access to the kinds of networks and interactions as we have today, right now. And then also on social stigma, the issues of the elderly. What is our responsibility as young people in terms of securing the safety in terms of the elderly, but also of children, where lockdown restrictions are now being applied where there is the movement and the reopening of schools. The violence of women, we know what has transpired in Ghana. We're also aware that this has been a problem in South Africa. We have not had any change in cases except for women being afraid of going to the police because ultimately they will be released, the perpetrator would have to go back to the home. And there's been many a discussion as to whether we move men into shelters as opposed to moving women and children into shelters for purposes of safety. And what are the criminal justice aspects that then emanates from the issues of vulnerability and violence? I think the other issue is forced sex, and I'm sure that MK will understand and give us a perspective from the DRC and understanding what forced sex during the lockdown period means, the abuse of women and children, and how do we set up alert signals, which we've tried, and sometimes it's not the easiest. The other issue around vulnerability of key populations, we'd have to touch on the vulnerability of populations like the LGBTQI+ community, women, children, the disabled, the elderly, but that has already will be covered under other issues. And then we've got the issue of the quarantine and restrictive measures and shortages of supplies. What does it mean in respect of food, access to testing, access to treatment, the role of the African Union, and then questioning these restrictions. The challenges of reopening schools, social distancing, and then keeping parents at home. What are those challenges that exist? And maybe one of the things that we need to look at in respect of the lockdown restrictions, and this came out, is the constitutionality in terms of the question around the constitutional power of government policy that can be delegated by the president to a body that appears to have no legitimate or constitutional existence. So how then in a disaster or a state of emergency does this then become legitimate? So those are questions I think that will, because we have quite a number of attorneys and advocates on the panel, that will be interesting to attend to. We know that at least 42 countries or more have been affected by the pandemic. What are the implications on the economic risks, the livelihood? Most importantly, the exacerbation of poverty as a result of the pandemic. The poor health systems, poor infrastructure, the already low confidence in government and in states, and how that will contribute towards further corruption or accusations of corruption against governance. And these are important issues for what does political stability or instability mean in the continent during and post the virus, simply because as young people, as leaders in our respective areas, we need to be in a position where clearly we're going to have to inherit these kinds of consequences in the future. And so I want us to then start. I want to welcome everybody officially. I hope that we are able to keep within the time. We already have a couple of chats. I want us to start with MK. MK, we're going to give you 5 to 6 minutes to present. You have been given the discussion overview, and so that we can just raise really high level pertinent points for the purposes of developing, extracting research, and being able to create policy framework and dynamic for the future. Thank you very much, guys. MK?
Okay, thank you. My name is MK Gamaliel, as all of you have heard, and I'm so happy to join this panel today. And I'm just going to have a brief overview over the topics that we're dissecting today. And first of all, I would like to start with regard to the stigma and discrimination. As you would know, there has been this notion that most of the guys or the people who have been diagnosed with COVID-19 are stigmatized because most of them are assumed that the transmission is being done willingly. But you should know that by labeling it as a transmissible disease is not correct, because it's not willingly. So we have to change the discussion around all of these, and it has to begin with the government. The government has to come up with measures to ensure that they identify where discrimination may arise. And this should really start from the government, because, you know, like in Kenya, there are those centers where people who are the quarantine centers, and you realize that the people who are yet to be tested and the guys who have been tested and cleared are not yet released. So you end up being mixed up. So even if you're released from the quarantine later on, even if you're free, everybody assumes that you have it. So, you know, and then there's also the perspective that if someone has traveled and has gone abroad and come back, it doesn't matter how many months, then they assume you have it. And, you know, this is very bad, because with the stigma, it makes people fear to go and do the testing. And it also slows the response, because, you know, the moment we have that kind of acceptance about the whole issue and have a good understanding, ensuring that we have good information from the government, that they share clear and strategic information to the populations in a way that they can understand. Because, you know, like most of our African communities, they're not as much as educated. And we have to keep that in mind. How do we reach to the people who are in the villages and communicate to them in a way that they will understand this message? Because if you don't do that, they will have their own perceptions, and some of them would think that this is a curse or something else. So we have to make sure that we bring it clearly on a legal and a human rights perspective. We address these issues clearly, And it's really bad because it's not the first time we're having a pandemic. Like in the Congo, in a way back, we had Ebola, and the same issues that are arising with regard to stigmatization with Ebola are the same issues, especially also with regard to the gender SGBV, sexual gender-based violence. It's exactly the same issues. During Ebola time, we were seeing a rise of numbers of women who were violated, and cases of sexual and gender-based violence were increasing. And it's exactly the same thing right now in Kenya and all other places. So we have to find a way of reaching those women, especially those women who are in the villages, because we're getting statistics, but we should understand that these statistics come from countries that are well developed, or they cater for those women who are in urban centers. But we have people who live in villages, and some of these villages still are experiencing conflict, and we are not reaching them. They're not being accounted for. So how do we reach them? We have to start that conversation and try to create a platform and a unity of sorts between all the consortium and the people who are human rights activists and human rights organizations, to make sure that we have a way of reaching these people. And we have to use technology, because right now you cannot go to the streets to protest. You cannot use the traditional means of activism that we used to use before. So we have to become more creative. We have to think about new ways of doing things in a different way. And I believe that it's just a matter of time. I believe this is the first and the most pertinent step to take. And if we continue doing that, we're going to get there. Oh, and one more thing that I have to clear, there's this perception that has been going around, especially from the leaders of many countries, that we are in a state of war. We have to be very, very clear that we can't equate the COVID-19 situation in a state of law, in a state of war, because in a state of war, there are certain rights that are abrogated. But still, even in a state of war, in the worst condition, human rights apply at all times. There is no way that we can say that the right to dignity, the right to life can be threatened because of the pandemic, because even in war, there's international humanitarian law. And in international humanitarian law ensure that the basic human rights, the basic human rights of the people are respected. So we have to make sure that we call our government into account. And because there's not much we can do, like go to the streets, we have to use the diplomatic channels to make sure that these issues are addressed, to make sure that
Thank you very much. You are just taking advantage being the first speaker. I'll give you just an ounce of a second to wrap up quickly, MK.
Okay. Yeah. So I would really like just all of us to think about these things critically and ask from ourselves, from our own perspectives, what can we do to make things better? Because we cannot just leave the responsibility to government. That's the work of the activists. That's the work of organizations that work with people who are vulnerable populations. Yeah.
Thank you very much, MK. We are now going to move to Cynthia. MK has overstepped. Cynthia says she has a 6-minute presentation. So Cynthia is going to put up her presentation and just quickly speak to the presentation. Thank you so much, Cynthia. We welcome you now.
Thank you, Magdalene. So I'm going to quickly share the presentation that I have, and we'll hopefully keep to the time limit. Just give me a moment whilst I upload that.
The challenge that we have while you're doing that, and let's just welcome a few people. We've got Jane Melchiade from Burundi, Isaac from Zimbabwe, Tadiwa from Zimbabwe, T.S. Benet from Liberia, who's in China, Paul from Ghana, Prince from Liberia, Oi from Nigeria. Just to say welcome. We haven't received any questions or any points as yet, but as they come along, we will. Are you ready for your presentation?
Yes, I am. Thanks, Magdalene. And I'm going to go straight into it. So as Magdalene introduced, my name is Cynthia. I'm from the South African Institute of International Affairs, and I'm also a scholar of the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung. And the presentation that I have today, it'll probably build on what some of the first presenters shared. when you talk about human rights, it is usually, for many people who are in the practice of law, we usually just refer to human rights, but I thought it was necessary. I'm going to ask one of the presenters to mute their mics. I can hear a bird chirping somewhere, so please mute your microphone. If you have your microphone on, please mute it. Thank you. So I found that was very necessary to the human rights discussion to talk about the framework in which we discuss human rights. So when we say people have rights, what exactly are we talking about? Which rights are we talking about? And if we're starting from the international frameworks, we have the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and this is legally binding for almost everyone else. And we also have the regional framework. So this comes to, if you belong to the Africa region, then we have the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, and then we narrow it down to the national laws. And one of the most supreme laws when it comes to national laws is the Constitution. And for many who are from the African context, are very aware that this is one of the laws that a lot of dictators like to flout, and they change the Constitution very often. And lastly, we have the customary law, and these are written or unwritten laws. So I can't kill somebody because whether the law says it or not, in my custom and my tradition, it is regarded as something that somebody cannot do. So in relation to the broader impact of the COVID-19, even though the Constitution grants us rights to do certain things, in the case of South Africa, Section 36 of the Constitution says the government has got the justification to limit human rights in certain circumstances. And in this case, the COVID-19 is the circumstance. So what has been happening over the past months and weeks of lockdown, there has been a limitation to the right of freedom of association. There's been a limitation to the right to move, the limitation in some cases, especially in the first few weeks, the right to education, schools and institutions were closed down. The right to trade, shops have been closed, and the right to privacy. And more importantly, we've seen across the African continent that there's increased surveillance either by the disposal of the military personnel into our communities to police and to monitor if people are adhering to lockdown regulations. So what does this impact have on general livelihoods? So if we're talking about the right to trade, we're looking at people who are either working as vendors, we're taking away food from their ability to participate in the economy, because most of the economies, rather, they've been on a standstill. So one of the most appalling cases when we talk about the response to COVID-19 and human rights was the case of Kenya, where we had News 24 and the Guardian News, where they had these two headings that I have here. And I said Kumbayalo because it's really a call for human rights activists to act in the bid to enforce lockdown rules. There were over 6 people that were shot in Nairobi in Kenya. And this was within the first few weeks of implementing the lockdown. So we had this headline from News 24, which says, International COVID-19 update, where even a young boy was killed. The Guardian News had also a very dramatic or headline, which managed to draw my attention, because these are the most extreme COVID-19 lockdown controls, and it is justifiably so, because if you kill people in the name of protecting them against an infection, that it is contradictory to the main purpose of state-led actions towards mitigating the impacts of COVID-19. So the Human Rights Watch in Kenya commented, it is shocking that people are losing their lives and they're losing their livelihoods whilst supposedly being protected from the COVID-19 infection. And I found this is a very powerful quotation to say, in the bid to protect people, to contribute to this collaborated effort to address COVID-19, people, particularly Africans, shouldn't be losing their lives. All right, so apart from the issues that I talked about, which mainly internal issues within countries, in the case of Kenya and in the case of South Africa, where the Constitution actually gives the government the right to intervene and limit people's rights, there's actually a whole lot of other issues that are coming into the discussion of human rights. So we're talking about human rights, just abuse of women, we're talking about limitation of rights, but also there's a right to be heard. So pre the COVID-19 pandemic, there was a lot of presumptions that, Africa is going to be hit the most by the pandemic, the impacts are going, and all these are presumptions, the impacts in Africa are going to be irrevocable. And admittedly so, the continent has suffered from the pandemic, but also I think the stats are showing a different case. So I think as academics, as scholars, as activists from Africa, we also have the right to be heard, the right to tell the African story. And this is in line with Africa Month, it is the right to be heard as well. And apart from the right to be heard, we've also seen in the international sphere, some sort of discrimination. So we can talk about intra-country discrimination dynamics, but also within the global sector, international airports are opening up. And Africa has got one of the lowest rates of COVID-19 infections. And this was brought up in a conversation that I took part in yesterday. But we have flights going to other countries and they're not coming to Africa, which already sets a tone for the global sector, global politics. What are they portraying to the world about coming to Africa, despite the fact that we don't have as many cases? Also, when we talk about the rights of different people, it's much easier to talk about rights in general, but it narrows down to rights of differently abled persons. And in many countries, Uganda, for instance, in South Africa, there's times where the president comes to make a national announcement and the lady who does the sign language translation is not there. So what are we saying about people who are differently abled? And I think as activists or people, we should be able to stand up for people who are not able to speak for themselves. Also the rights of prisoners. There's a lot of consideration and talk around early parole, around releasing prisoners into the community, but they have the right to be rehabilitated. And this is a conversation that we need to have as young leaders and as young Africans. And lastly, migrants and refugees. And these are also very vulnerable people within a sector. And it's a conversation that we need to have. If we're talking about a social plan within a country, under the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, nations have the obligation to take care of the welfare of refugees and migrants within their specific countries. So this is something that they have to work on. I tried by all means to do this within the given period. And in closing, I am going to leave you with this quotation that says, "The true measure of any society can be found in how it treats its most vulnerable members." So when we're talking about human rights, we're talking about prisoners, about refugees, about migrants, and about differently abled communities. And I think that concludes my presentation.
Thank you so much, Cynthia. We really appreciate that. We are really stranded with time, and I don't want us to not respect the fact that we also want to welcome everybody's on chat online. We've got people from all over the continent that are participating, and we are noting the questions. We are now going to go to Alexandra Fitzgerald. And Alex, please be considerate of time. I know it's difficult and you have a lot, but we might want to address some of the issues that you raised, pertinent issues, and then we can get back to them. So let's then go to Alex, our third presenter from South Africa. Thank you, Alex.
Okay, great. I'm going to try and keep it a little bit short. So in our South African context, from a legal perspective, none of the provisions of our constitution are suspended. They all continue to apply fully. It's only that the state can limit some of our rights in certain circumstances. But I think what is happening and what we're seeing is that the lockdown provisions and COVID-19 itself is just exposing some of the endemic problems that we already had. And that's probably not unique to South Africa, but is probably a pattern that we're seeing across the continent. And that includes problems such as police brutality, income inequality, anti-poor discrimination, the brutality of armies. So I don't think that it comes as a surprise, a lot of the stuff that is happening. And I think it also is exposing that some of the institutions which are intended to oversee and provide accountability to those organizations are not properly resourced, are not properly staffed, and do not have the proper requisite powers or functioning to provide the necessary check on power that we need to see our societies functioning during this crisis. So this is something that came up in the court case following the unfortunate death of Mr. Collins Kossa, who was killed allegedly by South African National Defence members. So what the court pointed out was that IPID, which is our oversight body, didn't appear to be able to respond to the complaints, and we have seen a sort of 12% rise in complaints of police brutality. So that is one of the areas that we've seen some issues with as well. Another area where we've seen issues with is that gender-based violence has obviously been, something that's very important, but funnily enough, the data is not supporting that we have seen a rise in gender-based violence in the way that countries in the Northern Hemisphere have. And there are many reasons for that, and that might be underreporting and the fact that people are still trapped at home with their abusers and are unable to report or unable to escape. That is our worst case scenario. What may have also been contributing is that we have had a ban on alcohol in South Africa, and that may have contributed to lesser rates, as well as combined with our lockdown, which is preventing things like rapes which happen outside of the home in South Africa, which are also very common with our very, very high rates of gender-based violence. But unlike places like the UK, which haven't had a ban on alcohol, they've seen a 700% rise in cases of domestic violence, whereas we have in our SAPS cases so far, taking into account obviously underreporting, seen a decrease in reports there. So it's something that we're going to have to keep watching and have to keep a very, very close eye on. Then I think with our vulnerable populations, I think that it's very important that overall we need to acknowledge as societies why these populations are so vulnerable to begin with. In South Africa, we have a huge population of undocumented people. They do not have access to the state resources and funds all the time that South Africans have had access to. So that may also include our asylum seekers, refugees, but undocumented people, especially child-headed households, rural communities, sex workers. These are all very vulnerable populations within our society. And I think that it's important for us across the continent to sort of reckon with why they are so vulnerable and what we can do sustainably to help them in the long term to make these population demographics safer in South Africa. And then just something that I always say when I speak in youth contexts, and this is a youth summit, is that we desperately need more youth representation in leadership positions across the continent. Youth are underrepresented at leadership levels, and it's so important for us as we not only face the crisis of COVID, but also simultaneously have to confront climate change, which is disproportionately going to affect us in the Southern Hemisphere and us on the continent, and how we can change our economic interaction with the rest of the world to be more equal and less exploitative of the continent and its resources. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Alex. I really appreciate that. We're going to go to, we'll come to a few questions, but I prefer this approach just so that we're able to get a sense of where everybody is at, and then we can start engaging and have more time for engagement and for closure. Our last panelist is Advocate Lebohang Matsoso, and we are going to hear from Advocate Lebohang. You have 5 minutes. Thank you very much, Alex. We look forward to your presentation, Advocate Lebohang.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate being part of the panel. And I must emphasize, or rather say, I wish to reiterate what has been said by my brother Gamaliel when he was talking about the issue of stigmatization. It is a very sad and unfortunate state of affairs whereby we see people, or where we see people not being freely going to, let's say, the health service centers simply because they fear to be discriminated or stigmatized. And this is whereby governments must see to it that they bring into place the issue of political correctness. I'm saying this because we have been hearing on numerous occasions certain political leaders who would just be referring to the pandemic as associating the pandemic to a certain particular location or nationality. We have had certain leaders say, calling it the Chinese virus. That by itself must be discouraged. So more so because it leads into the situation whereby people will not freely go and test, not only to test, but they might also the health centers. But equally important, we have learned as pandemics we have had, like the HIV pandemic, would not hear people being called as like people who are affected by the, or who have, we rather refer to them as the people who are affected by the disease as opposed to people with AIDS. Likewise, in this case, it would be advisable for people to be referred to as the people who have been treated for COVID-19. Another issue which it is worth discussing at this particular point in time is the issue of the second generation rise. I must emphasize or say that the fundamental human rights have to be respected, but in this kind of situation, it is understandable that this regard being had to the state of disaster, we might have some restrictions and limitations as the case may be. Just like in South Africa, we've been in a risk-adjusted lockdown up until to this very day, we are still in level 4. So in so doing, governments must see to it that they are doing so rationally and it passes the test of proportionality. Just recently, in my beloved kingdom, in the Kingdom of Lesotho, we've seen the situation whereby the Prime Minister, upon realizing, the Prime Minister as he then was, upon realizing that he might be toppled in Parliament, he invoked the provisions of the Constitution whereby he advised His Majesty the King to prorogue Parliament. To prorogue means to end parliamentary sessions. That is so because he was anticipating the situation whereby he would be toppled out of government. But then the matter ended up in the Constitutional Court, and the Constitutional Court, whereby his own party took the matter to the Constitutional Court to declare such prorogation to be null and void, and successfully so the case was heard by the Constitutional Court, and the Constitutional Court said was of the view that the Prime Minister in so doing acted irrationally. So by so saying, I mean, in as much as there are some limitations, in as much as there are certain circumstances upon which there are some restrictive measures which may be imposed by the governments, they must be done so rationally so. One other issue on the basis of international law. On the basis of international law, as someone who is working for the development agency or the development partner, being the Turkish Cooperation and Coordination Agency. Under international human rights law and the international health regulations, countries have an obligation to share technical and financial resources and information. And we have seen that in operation just recently as the Turkish Cooperation and Coordination Agency. We have been in operation, not only in South Africa, but also in Lesotho and in the Kingdom of Lesotho and Eswatini, where we donated PPE, personal protective equipment, and also some hand sanitizers and the gloves, as the case may be. In South Africa, we have seen in the Lebohang Hospital in Atteridgeville, there's a Turkish cooperation as our intervention towards flattening the curve. We donated N95 masks to Lebohang Hospital. So by so saying, I mean, countries are not on their own. COVID-19 is an international or global crisis, and as such, it needs global cooperation. We have also supplied food parcels in the Kingdom of Lesotho, more so because we do believe that the Constitution, which is the supreme law of the land, so provides that the marginalized, those who are weak, they have to be protected. And it is only when those groups are protected that we can be secure that our own rights are protected. That would be all for purposes of time. I would hate to see a situation whereby I seem to exceed the time which has been allocated to me. In the best interest of time. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Lebohang. We have one question. I want us to now focus on the fact that we have addressed a number of issues, but let's not repeat ourselves. There's one question that is specifically raised to MK regarding domestic violence, worldwide during this pandemic, and what is the best way to go about this issue. Can MK give us a very, very quick, succinct approach to the question that is raised by, and I would just, it is Sarah Youssef who raises this question. Can we have that question answered by MK, please?
Okay. Just a minute. Well, okay. I would like to say this. You know, the things with gender-based violence and violence against women and girls, it's very complex because we have to have enough data for us to know how we're going to react. And in most cases, we always have scenarios where we don't reach the most vulnerable people. And I think there is only one way that we can really address this issue. And the governments are really supposed to do enough, especially with regards to campaigns. You know, right now, it's very hard for us to organize lobbying and all that kind of things, but we can do media messages. Media messages can be done to ensure that we sensitize the people. But, you know, for someone who has a history of violating women or violence against women, it's very hard for them to be reached over by this thing. So I think the best way is using technology. And if we can integrate technology using the available data that we already have countrywide, then it would be possible for us to predict the patterns that are as they develop. And in that way, it will be easier for us to react and act in a timely manner, precisely, and making sure that we have a platform that integrates all the responders so that it will be easy. Because right now, the responders are supposed to be essential services. You know, people who offer the services to these women, people who respond. You know, the organizations and the experts and the social workers and all that are supposed to be categorized under essential services, so that when we have these cases, it would be easier for us to come out and respond. But you see, like right now, many organizations, most of the people who would have responded are not really working and are not categorized under the essential services. So it becomes a little bit hard. And again, also, you know, with regard to access to justice, right now it's very hard for them because, you know, most of the cases, most of the courts are not opening and most of the sessions are online. And sometimes it complicates the issue because there are still cases of even violence that happened before that is supposed to be followed up. And, you know, the challenge here is we have to understand that this issue is not just going to end with COVID-19. With other pandemics that come up again, we're still going to have the same issue. So we have to address it now so that we can safeguard the future.
Okay, thank you so much, MK. I think the point that we want to make is here in this discussion, let's come out with solutions. We need to be solution driven. We need to understand that our intention of holding summits and holding these kinds of discussions is for us to look at what is it. And one of the issues is creating awareness around gender-based violence, setting up systems where a person who's in lockdown in their home and can be able to send an SOS. People in communities who are aware of those who are perpetrators of these violence can constantly check up on their communities, on the people around them. Now, I want to disagree on the issue that in South Africa we've not had an increase. Statistics have been clear from the onset, but were adjusted of late due to the fact that the access to justice is a problem. And how do we then justify? The question should be, and this is one of the things that must be noted for the purposes of future planning as young people. How is it possible that police are so readily available for the purposes of brutality under a pandemic, but not readily available for the issue of rape, domestic violence, sexual, gender-based violence, etc.? And this is a major concern, because you would find that you go to the police, and this is one of the incidences that were happening in South Africa. A woman said, no, he's going to go in for the weekend and then you will be released. So I believe, and go back to basics, ground roots, the question that you asked earlier, how do we reinvent our forms of activism? because our forms of activism are now reduced to being able to communicate in this manner. And how do we make this kind of activism more available and accessible? And one of the experiences that are very clear is the movement of the People's Strike in the United States of America, where people are gathering together, coming against the fact that there are issues around the economic restraints, etc., but still saying what are our rights and how do we then ensure our rights. Very interesting as we map the way forward, and thank you so much, guys, for all of your contributions. Some of the questions that emanated from the discussion that came from many of the speakers was the issue of, are we in a state of war? And the compromise on first generation rights due to the COVID pandemic. And this is something that Cynthia, I believe, will be able to give us a little bit of insight into the education around the wars that have been called on by, ministers of police, those in leadership, to say, if you find them, I mean, we've now just read that the people who are not in their homes by 7 p.m. in Kenya are shot. We've had murders in South Africa of people in their homes, in their gardens. So apart from that, the police brutality issue, I think, Cynthia, if we can get from you, because the police brutality issue is an international issue, it's an issue of undermining of the basic human rights qualification. And I want you to specifically attend to that point, please, Cynthia. Thank you so much.
All right, thanks, Magdalene. Before I go to that question that you've asked, I think you missed one of the very first questions that some of the respondents had, and that's from somebody from Lesotho. Apologies, I couldn't get her name, but she's asking whether it is okay for the South African government to restrict movement to Lesotho. And that question was directed at me. So if you allow, I'll quickly respond to that before I go on to that question.
Yes, certainly, certainly.
All right. So to the participant who asked that question, I think what we have seen in South Africa is, especially from an international relations perspective, is not so much what South Africa is doing, but how domestic policies rather are translating to international policies. So during the lockdown, a lot of European countries have managed to repatriate their citizens back to their countries. You had Germany repatriating over 240,000 people back to Germany during the COVID-19. So it's not so much that South Africa does not permit movement to Lesotho, it's how it is done. Does domestic policy in Lesotho provide for emergencies to exit its citizens from countries during a time of national disasters? So it goes back to domestic policies. If your country has got policies that allow you to be repatriated in a manner that does not put the host country at risk, then it is allowed to do so. So I think it's a risk on its own to allow people to, on their own, move to their different countries. It has to be coordinated, given that the fight against Corona has to be, it's a global fight. Now, moving to the question on human rights and activism and police brutality, I think one of the reasons, one of the responses rather, that are applicable to many African countries is reverting to constitutionalism. And that is a key issue in human rights cases. Many countries, the likes of Zimbabwe, the likes of South Africa, we live in democratic nations, and our democracies allow us to put people at the center of state-led actions. So if we as practitioners and people in different sectors go back to realizing that the citizens of a particular country are actually the real government, if we revert to constitutionalism and say we can't enforce brutality because citizens are actually the ones who are in power, then it helps us to manage and it helps us to monitor the way we use power as the government or as the enforcing bodies, so as the police or as the military. Another way that we can do this is to continuously promote systems of checks and balances within countries. And in the case of South Africa, we have the Office of the Public Protector, but in many other African countries, this is particularly lacking. And it's very appalling because it gives the state a leeway to act as they want, because nobody brings them to book and questions whether they've done right by the Constitution, by the citizens, and also by their people. So I think constitutionalism and the promotion of systems of checks and balances in cases where the state misuses power as the response to that.
Thank you so much, Cynthia. I want to go to Lebohang. Lebohang, there's a question for you. I'm certain you must have seen it.
Yes,
I don't want to miss. You have. Can you very succinctly?
Okay.
Yes. Can you very succinctly respond to that question, please?
Stibelo Sisinyi from Tiatianing has asked as to what we have done to protect the fundamental rights of people with disability, in particular people who are mentally challenged. I must say that during our handover ceremony, we did hand over such equipments to the district administrator in the district of Berea. And the instruction or the agreement was that they would be given to the hospitals, 3 government hospitals, and also 20 clinics in the Kingdom of Lesotho. Then they would be given to all the vulnerable people. By vulnerable people, we'll be talking about people who are who like people who are in orphanages, people who are mentally challenged, or people who do not even know where their next meal was going to come from. So all has been done with the office of the district administrator, and I must say it is a sad state of affairs. If you have seen someone who is mentally challenged not putting on a mask, we had addressed it with the relevant authorities. But going forward, we would also have negotiations or meetings with the relevant Ministry of Social Development to see to it that going forward, they include people with disability in their policy development. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Lebohang. Okay, so those were the questions that came through, but these are some of the highlight issues. One question that came in was, not a question, but somebody just noted that they were present, and the guy is from Liberia, but lives in China. And I want the panelists to reflect on the issue of discrimination by China of African people. And many professionals, etc., in China itself. I want us to look at that issue and to suggest then what are let's not go into the consequences. We understand the consequences, because what we have is a post-COVID xenophobic potential, explosive situation on our hands, knowing what had happened to many of our people in China. I want us to also look, there's a question that came through on the increase in child marriages. It forms part also of the issues around gender-based violence, etc. And this is for the purposes of pure income for food and shelter. So these are not situations that are unrealistic. It may be underreported, yes, but these are realities that families and young women and children and the disabled, etc., and the vulnerable are facing. The other issue that has been raised around the issue of the African Union and the handling of the COVID-19, the role, I would have put it in the role of the AU, as well as the accountability of the African peer review mechanism. Now, I want us to also look at some issues. I think we touched on our need to change our attitude around activism, but that is something we will speak about in closing. So those are, I think, those 4 points. I would just like, let's start with Alex. I'm going to give everybody, hold on, 30 seconds, 45 seconds to respond to any of the issues they have been raised, and then we can move on to any other outstanding matters. Thank you, Alex.
Okay, just quickly, just to touch on gender-based violence, I think the issue is maybe we need to consider whether the police are at all the right body to be addressing this. And again, this talks about just COVID-19 merely compounding issues we had already. The police were already failing at mitigating gender-based violence issues and really prosecuting rape cases to completion. And so all it's done is compound that issue. And so I think that we need to really radical and very progressive and kind of transformational in letting our imaginations go in terms of how we can truly vindicate rights and address issues like this.
Okay, that's great. Thank you so much, Alex. Can we go then to MK? MK, any of your, I think the gender-based violence issue, but MK, maybe from your experience of sexual gender-based violence, the issue of child marriages, the issue of, female genital, those kinds of things that continue to perpetuate itself during the period of COVID, the consequences of and we'll come to the issues of infrastructure later. I think that's a very big point that we must raise. Can we just get a little bit, because this question has been asked on child marriages particularly. Just a short snapshot, please, MK.
Okay. In East Africa, in Kenya, in Rwanda, and in Burundi, there have been cases where we've seen that where there is a rise of numbers in gender-based violence, in the same communities, there's an increase in the numbers of child marriages. Now, the problem is some of the communities, it's very hard to report on the child marriages, but you can see that these trends are increasing. And because the governments have shifted their focus to responding to COVID-19, and because a lot of attention is being given to the violence, the gender-based violence, or violence against girls and women, we tend to forget the importance of handling the issue of child marriages. But as you can see in Rwanda, there has been cases. In Congo, there has been an increase of cases. But right now, we have to find new ways of dealing with these issues, because what used to happen, they had to report to the law enforcers, and then the law enforcers had to take action. But this time, no one is coming up, no one is reporting, yet we getting cases, people reporting that there are cases of child marriages going on, but it's very hard to follow up because you have to take these people and charge them under law, but now the whole process is becoming complicated. So we have to find new innovative ways of making sure that this issue of child marriages is inculcated into the whole discussion of gender violence and women's rights and girl rights. It's very, very important.
I agree with you. I think the major issue for us to attend to this is what then and how do we solidify NGOs and the role of civil society? Because I think it would be easier, as Alex said earlier, is the police the right body to be dealing with gender-based violence? Do they understand the issues relating to gender-based violence? And because we are such a patriarchal continent, and we can have that discussion at another point, it was never the intention of the continent to be patriarchal. We are nurturing by nature, but very destructive in terms of the aggression that is expressed in respect of male aggression towards female, the child. And it's not just child marriage. If India could have banned child marriage, this is a statutory rape. So if we see it as child marriage, what we are saying in principle, and if we can make the statement boldly during this period, is that it isn't really, this is criminality at every level. So we need to restructure our thinking around the issues of dynamics of child marriage, because marriage then almost legitimizes the fact that it is a child. So that's really important in terms on grassroots level, needs to be re-strengthened to a point of almost the steel resilience, so that the reporting and those that are maybe not formally, there is a trust and a care approach of how these interventions can then be accelerated. I want to go to Cynthia, and I want to just give us a synopsis on the issue of the APRM accountability, as well as the role of the African Union. There are concerns. Let's just place a precursor. If we look at the approach of 19, you find that there's a lot of disjuncture in terms of infections, deaths, etc., as well as lockdown. The question raised to Cynthia was, why is there no movement to Lesotho, for example? And there are periods that our government does allow for movement, but that's within the. Equally on repatriation, we've seen repatriation taking place in little pockets all over the continent and the world, which is still remaining a major problem. Our Minister of Home Affairs has just allowed now for those who are working and studying outside of South Africa to be allowed to then return. I want, Cynthia, apart from the repatriation issues and the issues of movement, to look at then what is it? One of the biggest arguments about the lockdown restrictions on Africa is its social stigma and its cultural incapability due to poverty, economic livelihoods, and being able to strengthen the compact of the African situation. Now, are we adopting once again approaches in the continent? We know that millions have passed on or have been infected as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. But how then do we protect our basic rights? Does the African Union and the APRM protect our basic human rights in terms of, and for Africans, it means being able to eat. You know, there are people who would say, let me give this plate of food to somebody else because I ate yesterday, and this is during the COVID pandemic. And we have a general poverty pandemic in the continent. How then does the AU consider not just the issues of that, etc., but poverty really, and the cultural aspects, social aspects of COVID-19, as well as the accountability by the APRM? Cynthia, thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Magdalene, for that question. It is very long, so it was very contextualized as well. But I think firstly, I'll have to highlight to you and the participants that Africa doesn't have a poverty pandemic. It is very misleading to say so. And I personally believe that we're one of the richest continents on the planet, and it is rightfully so. We don't have a poverty pandemic. What we have is a governance issue and a policy issue that does not allow Africans to benefit from the rich countries in the whole world. So it is very misleading to say Africa has a poverty pandemic. And what I would like to term this as a policy issue, and it's a governance issue, which allows corruption and which allows people, the elites, to benefit at the expense of the rest of the population. So what is the approach? And I think on Monday we had somebody from APRM. Lennon would have been very good on this panel to come and bail me out. But what I generally think that the African Union could do in terms of coordination and in terms of bettering their response to COVID-19, one of the issues is resources as well. And as I highlighted at the beginning of my statement, it's not that Africa does not have resources, it's that we do not manage our resources in a way that benefits us. So it's much difficult for the governments to have a budget for health to address the COVID-19 pandemic, because we already have hunger, we already have starvation, we already have more than 80% of people living in informal settlements in other countries. So starvation and hunger, amongst other insecurities, continue to plague the African continent. So that strains our resources to address the COVID-19 pandemic. And this is between how Europe responds to COVID-19 and how we do. Our resources are already strained. So I think there's better need for good governance. The APRM has been working on reviewing different countries, so different mechanisms from different countries. I think last year they were in Cote d'Ivoire, in Abidjan, and they were having an APRM meeting. And one of the things that they're doing is bringing the youth on board to say, we know we have a governance issue, but how do we bring the young people on board so that they participate in policy making, they participate in government issues, and we have sort of a broader and diverse perspectives in terms of governance in Africa. I think I'll leave it here for now.
Thank you so much. I think I want to say that we must be very cautious as young people. To say that we don't have a poverty problem in Africa, we're not disputing the fact that we are the wealthiest continent in the world. in terms of our natural resources. But the reality is we know that our people are starving. And these are the challenges that I'm not certain who it was that raised the issue of vendor. It was yourself who raised the issue of vendor livelihood and how the compromise of that becoming a compromise of basic rights. So I think it's important for us to be cautious about how we are able to vocalize the kind of messaging that we need to send out to our young people. And this goes back to one of the points that were raised in respect of corruption, the low levels of confidence in governments, the consequences of deepening corruption, and how COVID, the tenders or whatever are going out at the moment is going to contribute towards all the allegations that will be levied in terms of. And one of our instances where we had a political party raise an issue around the issue of Bidvest. Why does Bidvest get all of these? Is it a contractual issue? How is it then that we as African young people during this time, and this must then be the next question that Lebohang must be able to respond to, is at this time where poverty becomes so essential at the center of looking at how do people access food if they're not working, if there's a lockdown, there are restrictions, what becomes of the economy, the economic risks, Lebohang, for young people, not only during the COVID pandemic, post the COVID pandemic, what becomes of the economy of scale that Africa leverages, and how do we claim back this mineral strength and this resource strength that we have as a continent post the pandemic and during the pandemic, because we need to prepare adequately. Lebohang, if you can respond to that, and then we go back to other questions and comments that are coming up. Thank you so much, Cynthia.
Oh, thank you so much. Thanks for the question. It has indeed eloquently been said that Africa is one of the richest continents in the world. But as you can see, as of now, there are some challenges in the continent. And as I have already explained earlier on, this kind of a situation, in as far as I'm concerned, I would think it would need global cooperation with some other development partners. And that is why I would say, as the Turkish Cooperation and Coordination Agency, we come in. What do? We simply come to places or in places where we feel like people are being vulnerable, and we do some micro projects which would generate income for such people. And having done so, would not only be helping people, I would not only be helping people to bring food onto the table, but would be generating income for them. Of course, the incentives or the relief funds from the governments can still, to a certain extent, be helpful. But the most important thing is to create employment. Not only do we create, as employment supposed to be created, the governments, they must come with frameworks and be accountable to see to it that poverty is eradicated in the continent. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. We now move on quickly to Alex. Alex, if you can address us on the issue of China, and the person who was on the chat list of China, when China was then forcibly removing people, throwing them onto them to go. This was post China having, I think, quite a minimum infection. And this was in specific African young people and African people. Can you assist us with China's got a very significant imprint in the continent, and yet it is that it goes without accountability on such issues. What then, how would you then contextualize the accountability that Africa and the African Union must take, or any other institution that you might feel, to be able to respond to the issues that our people struggled with during this pandemic?
Yes, sorry to be a broken record, but I think, again, we just see the compounding of already existing issues. Africans in the world and in China were already facing considerable racism and anti-Blackness specifically across the globe, but in China already, and then this was further entrenched during this epidemic. And ironically, because Chinese people were also facing some xenophobia from across the globe, as you said before, the reference to coronavirus as the Chinese virus, etc. So I think that where Africans are in countries where they are being subjected to anti-Blackness, anti-African sentiments, you know, that is a responsibility of our government to intervene at the highest level in speaking to the governments of that country to try and get rid of that sentiment. But as we know, as South Africans, we have significant anti-foreign national sentiment ourselves that has deeply taken root in South Africa. We have our fear, and we know how deeply rooted and entrenched it is, and how difficult it is to root out as well. So although we can have a number of trying to intervene in all of these things and trying to raise awareness, I think that ultimately we have to acknowledge these issues, and we have to try and get our governments to be as responsible as possible with interacting, even though there is a power imbalance, because we know that China has all the resources and all the power at the moment sort of in the global economy, and we are sort of in this neoliberal economic mode. And I think that the only way we can do is to try, you know, as Cynthia's mentioned, as other panelists have mentioned, try to interact in our global economy in a way that is not exploitative of us as Africans.
One more thing, Cynthia, I just want to ask around the issues of oversight and accountability mechanisms. Now, when I refer to this, I want to refer to my earlier statement that I had made around issues around poor infrastructure, which you've also raised, the issues of health crisis, the corruption, low levels of confidence in the justice system or in government, and existing and post-political instability. If you can just take us through, look, the questions around the AU as well as the APRM have been there, but just very briefly over oversight, accountability mechanisms and institutions, so that we have a sense of how then are we able to structure and place forward what our proposals coming out of the summit are. Thank you very much, Alex. Very briefly, please.
All right, thanks, Alex. And Magdalene?
So the question was for Alex.
Cynthia, in your response.
So, I'm sorry. It was for Alex. Sorry, Cynthia. My apologies.
Magdalene, can we have Cynthia answer first? Because I think she was ready, and then I'll go afterwards.
Okay, but 30 seconds then. Okay, Cynthia, it's fine. 30 seconds.
All right, so my suggestion in regards to how the AU can ensure that we continue to enforce laws and policies that promote the citizens of Africa is having a policing board within the AU itself. And the APRM has over the years been sort of that governing board in terms of providing accountability and making African states accountable. But beyond that, we need to have punitive measures. We need to have consequences for flouting of human rights within Africa. So for instance, when Kenya shot the 6-year, the young boy who was shot in Matadi in Nairobi, the African Union should have been one of the leading institutions to speak out against it, to speak out against President Kenyatta, to say you're answerable to us as the African Union before you're even answerable to the international community. But we haven't been seeing that sort of action. It has sort of commented on, and that has been that. So I think we need to be more vigilant when it comes to implementing laws and making presidents and nations accountable to their citizens.
So much, Cynthia. I agree with you completely. I think that that's a very powerful, the accountability, making accountability. Just moving back to Alexandra Fitzgerald.
Hi, yeah, I completely agree, but I think also that we need to have a transformation at a leadership level with different representatives as well that are more broadly drawn from our African cross-class, across elite structures. Cynthia mentioned predatory elites, exploitation, corruption, and we are seeing those patterns being replicated in institutions with a lack of representation and a lack of transformation of representation. So if we keep having the same leadership, following the same methodologies, following the same routines, following the same processes, which are not progressive, which are not transformational, and which are not different to what we've done in the past. We are going to continue to see the same outcomes again and again and again. At the end of the day, we have to be honest with ourselves and recognize that where an institution has made mistakes in the past, it needs to be accountable to look inside itself and address transformation. And I think the AU really needs to start with itself first. And it's not the only international institution that needs to do that. A lot of our global institutions in this new sort of era that we find ourselves in need to look internally, see where the needs and gaps are, see where there needs to be broader representation across the globe, for instance, Africa at the UN level, and really try to transform those institutions so that they can begin to be accountable and responsive.
Thank you so much, Alex. We are almost at the verge of being out of time by just a few seconds. Just to say that one of the major things, I just want to thank all the panelists, thank the South African Human Rights Commission for being a partner in this project. It's really very refreshing to know that we can have a discussion at this level as young people, to be able to analyze and make a fruitful contribution towards what is the kind of Africa we want to see. And what comes out from the topic, and that being around the issues of COVID-19 and human rights, majorly, whether it is police brutality, stigma, etc., is accountability. And holding the AU accountable, having the AU say to Kenyatta what is going on in Kenya, having the AU say to Ghana what is going on with the women in Ghana. And this is important, whether it is the APRM or whether it is the African Union, there are structures in place which need to have teeth. But also the issue of good governance, and that comes out very importantly. The checks and balances around police, how do we use our states, how do we use the kind of infrastructure that we have for the purposes of protecting. The COVID-19 can very well also have implications on state and continental sovereignty with regard to the relations of China, if we are going to be conscious enough to understand what the implications are, if our people are being treated in such a manner when they are in China. And, you know, there has, as Alex has mentioned, this anti-so-called sentiment that exists. But we as young people need to be very conscious of the kind of liberal, neo-colonial kind of re-entry of other global economies and other forces into the continent. I think it's very important that we've had a very vibrant discussion. I want to thank all participants, and Tabi again, the president of the Breaking Down Borders. I want to thank the CEO of A Dare to Dream, Mr. Paul Majaji. And I want to thank the South African Human Rights Commission, especially those who have been actively participating. We wish that we could engage more. People are really raising the issues of the poverty, and the poverty that is not being created by African people or its land. The poverty that's been created as a result of poor governance and of how we are unable to, what Cynthia speaks about a lot, the issue of managing our own financial ability and our own financial resources, because we do have it. One of the things I think is digitization, and this is something that we must be able to call for continentally so that we are able to, in such instances, reach out to the masses of our people. And we've seen some of the common themes that have come out. One of the sentimental issues, and this is something I want to close with, is to send our condolences to those who have lost loved ones during this period, and to those who haven't been able to attend funerals, for example, who haven't been able to say goodbye, but also to be in a position where we remain activists in every form that we can. We have to be innovative, and we have to find new and creative ideas as to how we enter this space. It's been awesome. Thank you, Alexandra Fitzgerald. Thank you, Lebohang Matsoso. Thank you, Cynthia Chigwenya. Thank you, MK Gamaliel, from coming all over. Love back to your countries. And let's just look forward to see what the next level, but let us continue to participate and put pressure on our states and those like those institutions of trade, for example, that Lebohang is part of, for us to create a very vibrant future for an African economy, and not depend and not become a charity, remain a charity? What is our perspective on the global economy and the direction that we provide as young Africans? I thank you very much. Have a good almost weekend, or is it just permanently weekend for everybody? And please be safe, please take care. And thank you very much. The SAHRC EDB Summit, as well as Dare to Dream. Goodbye.
Okay.
Thank you. We must ask our organizers to formally suspend us.